Speaking to you from Washington, D.C., from the Planet World Museum. Sorry for not being able to be with you today, but I'm going to start to share my screen and show you some of the work that we've been doing on the acquisition of reading and how it works at the brain level. So I hope you can see the slides. If not, interrupt me, please, by speaking. So this is the place where I work in the south of Paris. It's called Neurospin, and each of these arches has equipment dedicated to seeing the brain, MRIs, EEG and MEG, electro and magnetoencephalography, and other scanners for animals. And we're trying to crack the brain and try to understand how it represents information. But in particular, we are very, very interested in the human brain, because the human brain has this very special ability to learn, this capacity to educate itself. And so this is my wife, Ghislaine. We work together to try to understand.
Just go to... It says show captions.
Sorry, I can hear you now. Could you not speak when I speak? Thank you.
But it's so tiny.
So, sorry, if you're speaking, is there a problem? Is there any problem? Shall you just go on? Okay, I'll assume that I can go on, but I have zero feedback. I'm sorry, this is a bit strange. So these are some of the techniques that we are deploying in order to visualize the child's brain. We start very early on. I heard that. Could someone give me any feedback whether this is going okay? All right, it seems to be going okay. Please don't speak when I speak because it seems to be interrupting the talk. I'm going to resume, and I see that you have resumed recording. All right, so I'm going to show you today several results about how we acquire language, and especially, of course, about how we acquire reading and what we can deduce from that about how we should teach reading. So one of the first images I'd like to show you is from 20 years ago. My wife and I found that we could scan very young babies. This is a 2-month-old infant, and discover the onset of language acquisition in the brain. We were the first to do so, and you can see our discovery here is that the child's brain at this age is already strongly attuned to spoken language. So we were playing sentences to these infants, and we observed that it was not the whole brain that was being activated. The information was being channeled to a very specific circuit in the left hemisphere. The left temporal lobe and the left inferior frontal region, Broca's area, were being activated by sentences. And you can see it's very similar to the adult brain. Of course, I'm not claiming that these babies are already understanding words and even less sentences. But the point is that the information is being processed by a dedicated network, a network of areas that are largely universal across all members of the human species. So this is for spoken language. For spoken language, there's a universal set of areas that you can see in any language that will activate to process the phonology, the lexicon, the syntax, the semantics of the language. This slide is from the beautiful recent work of F. Fedorenko at MIT. She's been scanning speakers of all sorts of languages across the world, and you can see that it's always the same network lighting up. Spoken language has a highly dedicated system, and it is also universal with respect to language within a given person. I think that there are many bilinguals among you. I am bilingual in French and English, and we all use the same network for both languages. If we look closely, we might see very small differences between the first and the second language, but by and large, it's the same system which is being engaged. If you learn language a bit late, then you might have more activation for the second language than for the first. But if you learn early enough, then the very same system is being engaged. So we have the same system, all of us, for spoken language processing. What happens when we read? Well, this is an image from an expert adult. It's actually coming from Berkeley, from the lab of Jack Gallant. They scan individual subjects. So this is really the brain of one person, left hemisphere and right hemisphere, processing spoken texts and processing written texts, okay? And spoken stories, written texts. And you can see that by and large, it's almost exactly the same activations that are being found. When it comes to the level of meaning, spoken and written language converge onto the same system. That is really important. We are not creating a new system in the brain by learning to read. We are reusing the very same spoken language system that we are developing from birth. So what exactly are we doing by learning to read? Well, we are recycling a pre-existing circuit for vision, for speech, and we're creating a new interface, a new input into the spoken language system. So here's the spoken language system. This is, of course, a caricature, very simplified, areas for phonology, lexicon, syntax, and meaning that are developing from birth. What do we do with reading? We are going to input into the system from vision. We use our visual cortex, which is the entry into the cortex of any image, including written words. But we're going to develop a very precise place, which I've termed the visual word form area with my colleague Laurent Cohen. We can call it the brain's letterbox, an area that knows about the organization of letters, how they are organized in space, and maps these letters onto the language system. And in particular, early on, this system maps onto a phonological representation of the same words in the planum temporale. Later on, might automatized mapping of the words into higher level lexical representations of spoken language. So the areas in red are what we are changing by learning to read. How do we know that? I want to show you that we have quite a lot of evidence about what changes in the brain when we learn to read. I suppose none of you can read this Rosetta Stone written in hieroglyphs. What happened when you learn to read a particular language system, writing system? We've done experiments where we wanted to make a whole map of the differences between literate and illiterate brains. And to do so, we scanned a variety of people that some of them simply didn't have the chance to go to school at all. There were people from villages in Portugal and in Brazil where the family didn't have the possibility of sending every child to school. And so some of them did not, and they remained illiterate. You could see here, we're going to correlate brain activation on the y-axis with reading score on the x-axis, which is number of words you can read per minute. And of course, illiterates are all the way down here at 0. We also had highly literate people like you and I, but also ex-illiterates, people who didn't go to school, but later on, maybe with their community, they acquire reading. So what you see on the left is areas of the brain that are shown in colors when they have a high correlation. They increase their activation as we learn to read. And what do we see? We see exactly what I just told you. First of all, we see areas of the left hemisphere that have to do with processing language in the temporal lobe, in Broca's area, and they are more and more activated as you understand what you're reading. We flash words on the screen. If you cannot read, you don't get activation in these areas. It's only when you can read that you access the spoken language network through vision. We see something else in the bottom here. This is the bottom of the brain, and you can see visual areas of the left hemisphere lighting up very strongly, also in the right hemisphere a little bit. These are areas that develop for recognizing written words. And we see a third thing. We see on the top of the temporal lobe, areas that have to do with spoken language. This is the activation now to spoken sentences, spoken words, spoken pseudo-words, increasing very strongly when you learn to read. What's happening there? Well, we all know that there is phonological awareness. Your ability to discriminate and especially to manipulate phonemes is getting better because you're learning to read. And we can see this, it's almost a doubling of the activation to spoken language because you've learned to read. We also see that the connection between the systems is being reinforced by learning to read. So I think all of this corresponds tightly to what I showed you on the previous slide. You are connecting vision to language because you've learned to read and increasing all of those brain systems. I want to talk especially about this visual word form system, the brain's letterbox. This small set of regions in the ventral side of the left hemisphere that are developing a vision of words. We know a lot about these areas, and some of this knowledge is very striking. All of you in this room who have learned to read, you're using the same site, plus or minus 5 or 10 millimeters, in order to learn to read. You have a specialized area that responds selectively to strings of letters, to pseudo-words, to words, more than to any other visual display. For instance, a display of objects or scenes, animal faces, even numbers. Here is our latest results from high Tesla fMRI, 7 Tesla fMRI. You see a single person, little patches of cortex that are being activated just by words, written words, and not by numbers, by false fonts, or by other displays. This area will only respond if you've learned to read, and it will only respond to the known scripts. So if you've not learned Hebrew, then it will not respond to Hebrew. And it really plays a causal role in reading, because if you have a small brain lesion, an infarct or a surgery to that area, you will suddenly lose the ability to read. You're not blind. These people say, you know, I can see, but I look at the newspaper and I don't understand why it's been printed in Hebrew. They don't see the letters anymore. They don't recognize the letters anymore. This area has to do with recognizing the strings of letters. It does so completely unconsciously. It can activate even to subliminal flashes of words. Whenever your eyes land on a word, even if you don't know about it, this area is going to be activated. So a very automatized system, which is the result of reading acquisition. This is a result from a very recent experiment in a single person. We can scan for activations to reading, and you can see these little patches of cortex that are being activated. In this experiment, we were presenting this person who was an English-French bilingual. We were presenting words in French, words in English, and all sorts of stimuli that are approximations to words. But you can see that as we go to the left here, well, maybe this could be a word in Polish, but it's not at all respecting the statistics of either French or English. And what you can see on the bottom is that this has a very strong impact on the activation of these areas. So we believe that these areas compile the statistics of the language that you know, in this case, French and English. So you see in the back of the brain here, it doesn't make much of a difference. These are all letters, and the visual system response has become attuned to the shapes of these letters and little bars and so on. But as you move to the front of the brain, this is the visual word form area here, where you see a very strong gradient of preference for stimuli that respect the statistics of French or English. So we believe that these areas provide a very fast encoding of letters and their relative positions. These are the areas that tell you that this is a stimulus where the N is on the left, there's a Y on the right, and there are letters in the middle that are A and R and so on, and allows you to recognize the word nearby, for instance. My point here is that, as far as we can tell, with millimetric resolution in a single person, there is no difference in a bilingual between reading the first or the second language. It's the same exact patches of cortex that are responding. They're responding to the alphabet, and it's the same alphabet. We got very slightly different results when we were scanning Chinese-English bilinguals. So here, this is a Chinese-English reader, and we presented words in English, words in Chinese, and then we went farther and further away from real words. And we could see that still, most of the cortex is responding in very much the same way. So all the areas in green are responding to both English and Chinese. And with a gradient in both, they really prefer real stimuli. But there were a few patches now that were selective for Chinese, probably because Chinese characters have their own structure, they have their own statistics, and this requires tuning to these particular properties of Chinese characters. But even then, you see there are really neighboring patches of cortex. And there are things that we simply don't understand. The patches that respond to Chinese respond also to faces. So there's an interesting relationship between reading and faces. It's using very, very similar patches of cortex. There's a little bit of competition and collaboration between developing reading and developing the face recognition system. So what changes exactly in children now as they learn to read? I've shown you images of adults that have become good readers, but can we also scan children? Well, yes, we can. We found nice ways to visualize the reading system in all sorts of readers. Here you can see the experiment we're doing. We're just flashing some words, some faces, some houses, and some checkerboards. We just flash them to children, and their task is actually not to deal with this, but just to detect an occasional target star. We've actually used Waldo. It's almost like detecting Waldo, right? The kids love it. They are just waiting for this particular target image to appear, and then they click a button. But we are really interested in all of these other images that they are seeing. What do they activate? And what do we see? If we scan 9-year-old readers, we can see very clearly this visual word form being activated. It's strongly responsive to words in any child that has learned to read. You can also see a skinny activation to faces here on the left hemisphere and a much larger one in the right hemisphere. So the face system is well organized in this 9-year-old reader, and it's using more of the right hemisphere than the left, okay? Let's look at a 6-year-old non-reader. And you can see now there is no visual word form, and there's also a much less organized system here for faces. So this is someone who cannot read. There is no specialized patch of cortex for written words. It's not just a matter of age, because here we're scanning 6-year-old readers, almost the same age. If they can read, we see this strong activation, and we see the beginning of an organization of the reading system. So key message here, the more you can read, the more there is an activation in the visual word form area. It's a direct reflection of reading scores. We can account for about 50% of reading scores by the amount of activation of this area when you're just presenting with words. We've done this experiment in more detail now with more subjects. This is a more recent paper. We're scanning a lot of children, and we've especially been attentive to recruiting children who are young and yet who can already read, maybe because they learn in families or they learn in preschool. So in this way, we have pre-readers and beginning readers almost of the same age. The beginning readers are just at the beginning of first grade, but they already can read, and you can see that they already have this visual word form activation in the left hemisphere here, this area that will only develop when they become more advanced readers. In this way, we're able to show that it's not age that counts. What counts is the experience with reading. Experience with reading and ability to read is the main correlate of the activation that we can see in this brain area, independently of age. Around the age of 5, 6, 7, 8, what matters is whether you've learned to read to develop this region. It's completely different for faces, and the contrast is interesting. For faces, what matters is age, probably because you're seeing faces early on in your visual development, right from birth, and you're slowly accruing evidence about how faces look like and how they behave. But for reading, with schooling, we concentrate the input of written words to a specific moment. In first grade, we suddenly bombard the child with written stimuli, and very quickly this area can develop and be engaged in recognizing letters. All of the brain activations I've been showing you so far were from groups of children, but in fact we can follow individual children. We can do that very ethically, and if there are any questions about that, I can guarantee you that this is very safe and actually very fun for children to see their own brains. So in France, a few years ago, we had permission to scan 10 children repeatedly every 2 months. We had 2 scans before school in preschool. We had 4 scans all along the first school year when they learned to read, and we had 1 scan a year later. And in this way, we were able to scan 10 children. Each color here is a different child learning to read. On the left, you can see their knowledge of grapheme-phoneme relationships. 0 is the entry of school. We selected children who didn't know how to read before school. They had very little knowledge of grapheme-phoneme relationships. But French schools are pretty efficient. I'm glad to see that. So here, these 10 kids quickly shot up, began to know the correspondences between letters and sounds, graphemes and phonemes. And you can see that fluency followed. This is how many words they could read per minute. It was climbing slowly but steadily as a function of the number of days they had in school. This is the first year, and this is the second year. So what happens in their brains? These are the first scans, where there's very little activation to words. And then here you see the onset of selective activation to words. You can see that there is distributed brain activity. I'll come back to that, but I'm going to zoom in first to these areas of the inferior temporal region, occipitotemporal region. You see that suddenly, as soon as you begin to learn to read, the children engage these regions that are going to develop, become stronger with time, and that's specialized for the written word. This is an image of greater activation to written words than to other stimuli, such as faces or houses. So very quick development of words, very different from the development of faces. Faces, we could already see activation in preschool, and they only got a little bit stronger with time. But since it was only 1 year, there was not much of a change. I don't know if you can see any change with your eyes here. When we did statistics, we could see that there was a little bit of a shift towards the right hemisphere. So now I hope you get a more concrete picture of what's happening. The more you learn to read, the more you specialize this area in the left hemisphere for written words, and the more you are shifting your face system to the right. Here's a picture of what might be happening. Before schooling, you have this cortex that is already well attuned to vision. It's already doing vision of tools, vision of faces, vision of houses. It has different cortical patches for these different domains of vision. But it also has some plasticity, some labile patches of cortex that can still change. And if you learn to read, you're going to specialize some of these patches of cortex for words. And if I scan you, I'm going to find some voxels, some parts of the brain that are specialized for words, maybe with a little bit of response to objects. If you don't go to school, these patches of cortex are going to be invaded by what you are seeing in your environment, which is faces and tools, and you're going to see the very same voxel now responding only to faces and tools. So you're changing the tuning of a brain system that is already engaged in vision, but will learn to map letters onto the language system. We can actually model that system. I'm sure you know that there are now very good AI systems that are learning to recognize images. They take images as input, and as output, they can give you a label about the image. This is an image of a cat, this is an image of a dog or a snake, and so on. They can have a lot of labels at the output. Well, what we've been doing is using these networks, which are inspired by the brain, have a certain correspondence with the brain. We are recycling them to learn to read. So we're adding reading as input, and as output, we're adding 1,000 words that they have to recognize, regardless of font, regardless of whether they are in uppercase or lowercase, and so on. And in doing so, we're finding that we can simulate what happens in the brain of children. We see that there are several units that are becoming tuned to letters and words. They respond just to strings of letters, not to any other stimuli. And if we analyze them, we can see that there are individual neurons, individual units that are caring about letters and letter strings. And this helps a lot because, as you know, with brain imaging, we cannot see single neurons, but we think that the neurons are actually doing the computation. So what are they doing? Well, we think now that there's a sort of barcode for every word. Each time you see a written word, there are some neurons that care about the beginning letters, there are some neurons that care about the end letters, there are some neurons that care about the middle letters, and together they give you a sort of unique barcode for what is the word identity. So we found that there are some units, for instance, that like the letter A on the left of the word. They are position specific. They like the letter to be the first or the second. There are other units that like the letter R, and in this case, they like the letter R on the right. We think that there are probably hundreds or thousands of such units in the brain of a good reader that allow you to distinguish any word, and especially to distinguish anagrams. They care not just about letters, but also about their position, and this allows you to recognize words and to distinguish words that have the same letters, but in different order. So letter and their positions are extremely important for this brain area. Okay, so now I'd like to say a little word about what happens when children struggle with reading. I know that there are many teachers in the audience, and you have kids that don't seem to acquire reading so easily. So what happens with them? Well, we've done exactly the same experiments in struggling readers, in dyslexic readers. So again, we flash some words, faces, houses, or checkers, and this is what we find. In 9-year-old dyslexics, even though they had 3 years of reading acquisition, the visual word form area is not developing normally. The letter box is not responsive to letters more than to other stimuli. Compare this to the development of a normal child here. You have a strong specialization for words, which is not appearing in the brain of dyslexics. You might notice also that the whole organization is not perfect here. In fact, faces are not developing completely normally, and this is a consistent finding in our work. The left hemisphere is not developing this specialization for words, so we see less activation in dyslexics than in normals, but we also see a reduced activation for faces in the right hemisphere. So there is something about the visual organization which is not normal and which is a signature of dyslexia. Now, I want to be very careful here. We don't know what is the cause and what is the consequence of dyslexia. This lack of activation could simply be the consequence of not learning to read, right? If you're not learning to read, you're not specializing this area. In many cases, we think that the cause is elsewhere. For instance, in the phonological system. Perhaps vision is also the cause in some dyslexics, and I'll come back to that in a second. But these images are just showing us that we have a biomarker of dyslexia. Lack of activation of the visual word form area is a very good biomarker of disability to learn to read. We have replicated this many times. I would like to point out to this recent study in particular. We collaborated with Xiaoxia Feng, and we scanned Chinese as well as French 10-year-olds when they were watching words and other stimuli in their language, and half of the children were normal readers, and half of the children were struggling readers, dyslexics. And the very striking finding is that the reduced activation of the visual word form area is a universal signature of dyslexia, even in Chinese. So these are the French subjects. You can see strong activation in normal readers, lack of activation in dyslexic readers, but very much the same in the Chinese subjects. The control subjects who are good readers have activation in this occipitotemporal region, the visual word form area. The dyslexics do not. And in fact, there was this very strong reduction in activation in struggling readers, regardless of whether they were French or Chinese. I hope you're getting my message. Whether you read in one language or another, very, very similar circuits are being recruited. And if you're struggling, very, very similar impairments are being shown. It's not just in the visual word form area, but the visual word form area is a very strong marker of dyslexia. Its reduced activation is a very strong marker of dyslexia. But there is, of course, a whole network. So here are some of these other areas that show greater activation in normal readers than in dyslexic readers. You can see superior temporal regions, also inferior frontal and precentral gyrus regions. Here is another view of the same network. When we just correlate with reading scores, again, we can predict about 50% of the variance in reading scores just by looking at the brain and seeing that these areas are not enough activated. So it's a whole network that is being recruited by dyslexia, but it's very, very similar across all of the world's languages. In fact, we found only one difference between Chinese and French reading in this parietal region, but there was no interaction of reading ability and language. The reading impairments have very similar origins at the brain level, regardless of culture and writing system. So here is a little summary of things that we think we know about dyslexia. I go back to this schema that I showed you earlier with spoken language areas in green, and in red, the areas that are developing and becoming attuned to reading because you are learning to read. And it's important to understand that I'm speaking of dyslexias in the plural with an S here, because we think that this circuit is complicated enough, and I'm really showing you a very simplified view here just for the purposes of this talk, but the reality is even more complex. But there are many, many places where it can fail. And therefore, there are many different subtypes of dyslexia. And with Cassandra Potier-Watkins and with Nama Friedman, we're struggling to try to separate different subtypes of dyslexia. But at the very least, we think that there are cases where it's the phonological representation that is impaired and creating difficulties in learning to read. So subjects don't hear very well the differences between phonemes. They cannot categorize them very well. They have difficulties in phonological awareness. In other cases, it's probably the connection between vision and language, the grapheme to phoneme conversion itself, which is impaired. But also in other cases, and I think there is growing evidence for this now, it's really the visual code for letters, which is the source of the difficulty. And these kids have a visual form of dyslexia. And in fact, we know now that there are multiple forms, subtypes of visual dyslexias. I want to tell you about the two main ones, the most important ones for your practice, perhaps. One of them is letter position dyslexia. These are kids who have trouble with the inner letters of words. And so you might show them form and they will read from. They are switching the middle letters. They don't really know in which order they come, right? How can you help these children? Well, these children are helped by just tracing the word from left to right, and especially by inserting spacing between the letters. So Nama Friedman has found that it's enough to just tell them, scan the word from left to right, perhaps using your finger, and you will see that you will get the position of the letters better. And then they're helped with this. And because they can read now almost normally or normally, we can see that their problem is not with grapheme phoneme conversion or phonology, it's just with getting the order of the letters right. We all have problems with the order of letters. There are all sorts of situations where we make mistakes of this kind, but these children make more mistakes than others, and they can be helped by being reminded that the ordering of the letters is extremely important, and inserting a little space between the letters can help them. But there is a different subtype of dyslexia, which is called attentional dyslexia. It may not be the best name, but it draws attention to the fact that when you are reading, you need to pay attention to one particular word and neglect the others for a while. And then you're going to move your eyes to the next word. And these kids have problem with selection of a single word for reading. So if you give them two words like form and pale, they might say farm and pole. Can you see the error here? They are borrowing one of the letters from a surrounding word into the current one, or vice versa. And notice they have the letter position perfectly well. Here they are borrowing the second position letter A in second position, into the second position of the current word to give farm. So they are very different from the previous ones. They don't have any problem with the position of the letters, but they have problem with focusing on the current word and not getting interference from a neighboring word. How can you help them? Well, once you've done the proper diagnostic, there is a very simple way to help them. It costs nothing. Just cut a piece of cardboard. You cut a hole in a piece of cardboard and show them how, if they slide it, they can see one word at a time. And suddenly they become normal readers. And because they become normal readers, we can say that it is not a problem in grapheme phoneme conversion or phonology. It is really just a problem in not getting interference from the surrounding words. So this is ongoing work. It's very recent work, but we think that we more and more understand how the complex circuit for reading can be impaired in different places, and the neural code for reading can be impaired in different ways, and we can begin to help these children. It's really important to get the diagnosis right for dyslexia in order to help them better. Okay, I'll move now to the third part of my talk. Given this knowledge, how can we help teachers teach reading? I will not surprise you in telling you that I think explicit phonics, synthetic phonics is the best way. I don't think that all children should be little Champollion. Imagine having to decipher the hieroglyphs here. This is actually from Champollion's booklets, book notes. You can see that this is enormously difficult. It took one man, an expert man, years to decipher. We don't want our children to do this. We want to teach them explicitly how grapheme to phoneme conversion works, how letter works, how the alphabet works. And they don't have to reinvent it. We're just going to tell them explicitly. I showed you that there is this circuit in the brain which is turning letters into sound. We think we know now that this is the circuit that needs to be told. Let me remind you, first of all, that it's very different for spoken language versus reading acquisition. Spoken language, I told you at the beginning, starts at birth, and it's this slowly developing system that is going to accumulate evidence at the rhythm of about 10 new words that are being learned per day. This is an approximation, can be 10 to 20. But even at this rhythm, 10 words per day, it will take you 10 years or 15 years to become an expert in your spoken language, right? This is a slow system that develops right from birth. In fact, even before birth, in the womb, babies are already becoming attuned to the prosody of the language. When they are born, I show you they already respond to spoken language, they are already in the first year, even when they are not speaking, they're already accruing a language, they're already accruing vocabulary, maybe 50 or 100 words before they are 1 year old that they can recognize, even though they cannot speak. And then vocabulary is going to grow in this way. So, of course, we want to enrich preschool. We want to help parents speak to their children. This is extremely important. There is a critical period here at the beginning where if children don't get any input of language, then they are going to have deficits during their entire life. If you have children that are deaf, it's very important because, well, there are two possibilities. They can learn sign language, and sign language is a perfectly normal language, and then they are going to be fine. Or they could be equipped with cochlear implants, with hearing heads, and then they are going to learn spoken language, and they are going to be fine as well. But if they have neither of these two possibilities, if they have deprived of their first language during the first year or maybe the first 2 years of life, this critical period, then they are going to have lifelong deficits. So we really want to emphasize the importance of spoken language. Spoken language is the critical basis on which reading is based. But what happens with reading? Reading is completely different. Reading is like a silver bullet decoding that you introduce in first grade. Suddenly, you introduce decoding, and it doesn't have to take a lot of time. It takes 6 months, 12 months. You give them the ability to decode words, and then, of course, it's not finished, but now children are going to be able to acquire more vocabulary, new words, sentence structures through reading. So maybe they are not getting enough vocabulary from their families. Maybe their families are not speaking the target language very well, but because you've taught them to decode, you're going to help them acquire new words now through the written modality. And remember, I told you it's all getting into the same comprehension network. The comprehension network is the same for spoken language and for written language. So now you're giving them the ability to acquire a lot more vocabulary as long as they are reading. Give them decoding, and they are going to acquire enormously more about their target language. So all of these steps are important. Preparation to reading by a good basis on spoken language, introduction of a fast decoding period, and then consolidation and reading in order to develop reading vocabulary. I wrote this little book, which is also translated in Spanish, but unfortunately not in English yet. It's coming, to try to concentrate all of the knowledge that we know from cognitive science and neuroscience that teachers should know about this process of deciphering letters and entering the language system from vision, reading. We want to first train what we call the phonics route, the decoding route, from letter strings to phonology, and then we want to automatize it so it goes a little bit faster into the lexicon. And what is the best way to do this? Well, there are lots of experiments that I try to summarize here. We want explicit teaching of grapheme to phoneme conversion rule, what is called phonics, synthetic phonics. We want to use a systematic progression. Let's not just do random presentation of letters. We know that some letters are easier than others. Some letters are more important, they are more frequent. So we're going to use the statistics of the language to create a curriculum that starts with the easiest and the most frequent grapheme to phoneme conversions, and then we're going to go to the less regular ones later on. We want very careful guidance of visual attention. There is something non-trivial here. The alphabetic system in our language goes from left to right. Let's teach that to kids. This is not trivial. It's not something that they can gather from the input. It's not written. There is no arrow that says start here and go from left to right. If you think about it, this is one of the most intelligent and abstract aspects of our alphabet. The person who invented the alphabet had this idea that the time of the spoken word can be converted into the space of the written word. Time in the spoken modality is converted into space on the page. How abstract does it get, right? Time to space. This is not trivial at all for children, and you have to guide them, to guide their visual attention, show them maybe with a finger that it goes from left to right, that you start with the first letter and slowly convert them into sounds. We know from a lot of experiments that you need to associate reading and writing into active learning. Writing helps a lot. The gestures of writing are going to help children decode the letters, understand the shapes of letters, and remember them better. And finally, and I will go back to that in a second, we need to automatize. It's not enough to just do it once and you know how to decode. No, you need to practice, and retrieval practice, just like in many other domains of learning, retrieval practice is going to make you more perfect, faster and faster. One thing I want to emphasize, because it's a constant source of misunderstanding, is the joint importance of both decoding and comprehension. Many teachers oppose decoding and comprehension. They think that if you're doing decoding, you're not doing comprehension. But that is not at all how cognitive scientists think about it. The two are completely complementary. If you want to understand what you read, you need both. You need to know how to decode the characters of writing, and you need to understand the target language. Think of the hieroglyphs again. Suppose you learn to decode the hieroglyphs. You would still not understand because you don't know the Egyptian language. You need both the Egyptian language and understand how hieroglyphs work, right? So this is the proper model of reading. And this is a very old one, as you can see. It's called the simple vision of reading. And it says written language comprehension is the product of decoding skills and spoken language comprehension. So you need both. I think you understand this equation, right? If one of them is zero, then you are not going to have language comprehension. This term is going to be zero. So if you cannot decode, you're not going to read. But if you cannot understand spoken language, you're not going to read either. You need both. You need to develop both, but remember, the timing is very different. This takes maybe 6 months, 12 months. You immediately start kids on decoding at the beginning of first grade. And by the end of first grade, they should be able to read something like 50 words per minute. This is the national standards in France now, 50 words per minute. Spoken language comprehension, of course, takes a lot more time. And it needs to be building up from birth and all the way into adolescence. This equation has been validated many, many times. And in particular, there is really no opposition between decoding and comprehension. The evidence is that if you train decoding, you're actually improving written language comprehension in many, many studies. So please don't oppose these two. Children need this silver bullet of decoding. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary in order to learn to read. One more point. Very importantly, children need to be able to consolidate their learning. This is true for any form of learning. As I explained in another book of mine, which is called How We Learn, every learning episode starts with explicit, conscious, effortful processing. You are making a very strong effort, in this case, to decode the words. And you need to automatize in order to free the resources of this effortful system, the prefrontal cortex, 1/3 of the brain in the front here, in order to transfer the knowledge to more efficient, non-conscious circuitry. And in this way, you will free the frontal cortex for other tasks, for other aspects of learning. If we take the example of reading, this is very clear. This is the curve for reading speed, how long it takes you to recognize a word in the first year, second year, third year of learning. So first grade, second grade, third grade, and you can see dyslexic here. What do we see here? We see the effect of the number of letters. So this is a 2-letter word, 3-letter, 4-letter, 5-letter word. In the beginning, you see children are struggling. It takes them more and more time for longer words. I'm sure you are highly familiar with this in your experience of first graders. They are struggling, and the longer the word, the more they are struggling. But this effect goes away, and that's the effect of automatization. By the second year, it gets flatter. By the third year, it's almost completely flat. And in all of you in this room, you can read short words of 2 letters and long words all the way into 8 or 9 letters just as fast. It's parallel processing. You are treating all of the letters at once. This is the result of automatization. You no longer have to do it serially, one by one. You can do it all at once. So automatization is absolutely essential. Automatization will free you from thinking about the decoding and let you concentrate on the message. For instance, imagine reading a problem of mathematics. You cannot concentrate on the mathematics if at the same time you are still struggling to decode. So we need to automatize the system. Would you be able to understand if you had not automatized reading? I'm going to test you on a little reading passage. See if you can read this. Okay, I imagine that you had enough time to try to decipher this. One thing, first of all, I think you had this feeling of being relieved, right? When you reached the last two lines, suddenly it's all so easy, right? Why is it so difficult at the beginning? Well, because you're not familiar with this particular grapheme phoneme conversion that I forced you to do here. You had to, decipher it. And one question, could you understand what you are reading? I think it's very difficult to understand, not just because this is Marcel Proust, and of course the sentence is a little bit complicated, but also because you were concentrating on the decoding and you could not split your attention and concentrate on the message, on the comprehension. So we see here how important it is to learn to automatize the parallel recognition of words. I'm going back to this experiment that I was showing you where we're following the development of reading in single children. So just to remind you, at the end of preschool, there is very little specific activation to written words. As soon as you enter first grade, you see this explosion of activity. And what I did not show you so far is what happens 2 years later. 2 years later, you see the circuit has become much more concentrated in the back of the brain, in the occipitotemporal visual word form area, this letterbox, and also in the left temporal lobe here in phonological and lexical areas. But you see, there is initially this huge activation, which is in prefrontal cortex, in parietal cortex. It's the attention, it's the working memory, it's the effort that children deploy in order to decode, and which leads to this linear increase in reading time as a function of word length. We really need to move from this stage, which is effortful struggling to decode, in order to move to this stage, which is fluent decoding. But there's no way to jump. Wouldn't it be nice if we could directly go to fluent reading? Wouldn't it be nice if we could just concentrate on comprehension and not do decoding, right? Well, we can't. I'm sorry, we cannot. We have to go through this intermediate stage, all of us, where we struggle and then we automatize. There's just no skipping of this decoding stage. Some 6 years ago, I left the lab for a few hours a day. I was called by the Ministry of Education. The minister at that time wanted to create a scientific council for national education. And so I put together a group of 25 scientists of all disciplines in order to advise on aspects of education. And I want to tell you a little bit about our efforts to convert the science of reading into efficient policy and help for teachers and teacher trainers in order to provide tools to reduce the education gap. So what did we do? Well, we published several documents to provide teachers with tools to evaluate how well they are doing in reading and also to guide them. One of these tools has been called the EvaLED system, a little bit like the US Ed. It's a system of evaluation of pupils so that we can see every child, how well they are progressing and whether they need help. Every single student in first and second grade in France receives cognitive tests in spoken and written language, numeracy, and geometry. This includes phonological awareness, knowledge of letters, knowledge of words, fluency, so that we can see whether children need help. And a few weeks after taking these tests, every teacher in France gets feedback about his classroom or her classroom. 20 children, every one of them, about 15 or 20 tests that tell the teacher, this child may need help in this particular domain, right? So this is really a way to receive a detailed picture of each pupil's needs and also how well they are progressing in the middle of the year. This also allows us to develop national standards. Here we have a reading fluency, number of words that could be read in 1 minute in 6th grade. And the target is here, 110 words. But we can see that even at that age, we still have children that are struggling to read. They are below grade level, and we can help them. These sort of national standards are very helpful because they set precise goals, the very same goals, regardless of your social origin, whether you are bilingual, whether your parents are from a poor family. We have the same exact standards, and we know that all children have similar brains and all can learn to read at the same speed. We also try to guide teachers on the amazing choice of reading manuals. In France, it's crazy. You have something like 35 main manuals of reading. Some publishers are making a lot of money out of this, and they even have rootless practices. Like some publishers have two manuals, one for whole language and one for decoding, just so that they can sell both. So we are trying to study what is the impact of a manual and how can we guide teachers selecting the best practices. Here is a recent study in France where our colleague Jérôme Dovio asked 10,000 teachers, which manuals do you use and do you use sight words? In France, there is no longer whole language. Basically, the whole language has essentially disappeared. But what we have, I think it's the same in California, is we have mixed or balanced reading. So teachers do a little bit of everything. They do phonics, but they spend also a lot of time with whole language practices, such as, sentence guessing and so on. And in particular, there's this belief that you have to use sight words. So most teachers here use between 10 and 30 sight words in their classroom in the same time that they are using phonics. And there's only a very small fraction of teachers who use these manuals here. They're not familiar to you, but these are the pure phonics manual that don't use sight words and don't use balanced reading methods. So who is right? Do we have evidence? Well, Jérôme Dovio correlated the use of these manuals with how well the kids were progressing in our national evaluation system. And the evidence was very clear. These practices, pure phonics, synthetic phonics, without sight words, were giving the most progress. They were producing the better results. They are the most efficient in not only decoding, but also comprehension of written materials. And it was even possible to have the kids from popular schools with low socioeconomic status be ahead of the more favored schools just by changing the teaching methods. So teaching methods are very essential, and we strongly believe that teachers should be using manuals and should be following systematic progressions in manuals, and there is no need for sight words as far as we can see in this study. So we are publishing documents for teachers, trainers, authors, and publishers. And in fact, we are reaching a stage now where we're going to advise the ministry. The ministry has decided that all teaching manuals should be labeled according to how well they agree with the science of reading. So we're helping the ministry to decide on the criteria for what is the science of reading, what should be respected by the manuals because it works better for the kids. So I just finished with some very simple practices that you should avoid. I'm not saying that the situation in France is perfect, not at all. A year ago, we published this alert to the Ministry of Education because we could still find classrooms where in the first grade, in the first week of first grade, teachers were presenting whole text, entire text, and they were asking children to read them. How can you read if you're not able to decode, right? So this was encouraging guessing, remembering by heart a specific text. This has nothing to do with the proper practices for learning to read. I can show you even worse. There was a teaching system where you would present this. Can you read it? Nobody can, because the letters have been replaced by triangles and circles and squares. The idea is that this is a way to encourage guessing. But guessing has nothing to do with reading. And here, nobody can see the letters, so nobody can read. This is completely absurd. Please don't do this. In France, of course, we have sight words, but we even have, selecting the proper word among many, even before you've learned to decode. So this is quite absurd. This has nothing to do with learning to read. We also have, I don't know if you have this, we have some practices of teaching the phonetic alphabet. Now, the phonetic alphabet is a very complex system that even researchers like me, we don't know so very well. So why would kids have to learn it, in a manual? Why would they have to learn this particular letter? It's even worse because this is supposed to be the letter U, but of course it looks like Y. And the kids are completely confused by having to learn the second alphabet next to the first that they already don't know. So please don't do this. Learning to read is actually quite simple if you focus the learning on the correspondences between graphemes and phonemes and don't do all of these other distracting practices. I'll just close by saying, that researchers are sometimes accused of being in their ivory tower, using their imaging machines, and they never go in a classroom. Well, that's not the case in my lab. We actually have a whole team, which is led by Cassandra Potier-Watkins, which is developing tools for teachers. We developed this Kalulu program, which is software plus pedagogy to acquire reading in a few months. We try to concentrate in the software all that we know that is helpful for young children. So all that I've told you, plus some other tricks from the science of learning, for instance, active engagement, error feedback, interleave teaching and testing, daily practice followed by sleep, and so on and so forth. I won't have time to go through all of this, but there is a systematic progression. In fact, we're using AI techniques these days to develop the automatic progression. We can take any language, let's say Turkish, give me the text in Turkish, and I can give you the statistics of which letters are the most important, which should be taught first, and so on. We have lessons that include seeing the mouth of a child speaking the particular phoneme, understanding which words start with this phoneme, and tracing the corresponding letter with your finger. It's a little bit like the Montessori sandpaper letters. It's very useful for children to trace the letter and therefore to remember the shape of this letter. We automatize reading inside the software, and we can track what I showed you, this progressive flattening of the length effect, the length curve, as children become more automatized in reading. And we are doing randomized controlled trials to show that really this is helpful in real classrooms. We do that in Brazil, in Portugal, in Uruguay, in France, and so on. Conclusion. This is me wearing one of the lab's devices to monitor brain activity. I want to generalize a little bit in my conclusions. First of all, I hope I've convinced you that the infant brain is a wonderful device. A highly structured organ, of course, it's not random. We all have the same sort of brain architecture right from birth, but also with considerable plasticity, which allows it to become attuned to any writing system. I really consider that it is a supercomputer, the best supercomputer we have on Earth today, better than any AI. So it needs to be fed with structured inputs, a well-designed curriculum with explicit teaching, no discovery learning, very structured input. And I really think that education must be based on scientific principles. So we must work together in order to discover the brain's learning algorithms. I'm not claiming that neuroscience has all the answers. We're still struggling to understand how the brain works. But we must work together to design experiments to test what works best, what pedagogy works best. And above all, and this will be my final word, we need to accept the results. What I've told you today about phonics has been known for 30 years. It's been said very well by the national reading panels almost 30 years ago. The whole language method is simply unacceptable. There is no need for sight words and all of these complications. Synthetic phonics really works. We don't have to search for bizarre solutions. Let's just respect the current state of scientific results. And with that, I will thank you very much.